In the frozen expanse of the Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper commanded what would become one of the most infamous armoured units of the war. His Kampfgruppe represented the vanguard of Hitler's final desperate gamble, a massive offensive designed to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. As his Tigers and Panthers crashed through the thinly defended American positions that morning, achieving complete tactical surprise, Peiper found himself preoccupied not with enemy resistance, but with something far more prosaic and infinitely more critical. He was obsessed with his fuel gauges. The German offensive, grandiose in its ambitions, rested on a foundation of sand. Hitler's plan called for 3 entire armies to punch through the American lines, cross the Meuse River and drive all the way to Antwerp, severing British forces from their American allies. The capture of Antwerp wasn't merely a strategic objective. Hitler had convinced himself and his generals that the port's massive supply depots would re-equip Germany's starving armies. This wasn't an auxiliary benefit of the operation. It was in fact the operational concept itself. German forces would sustain their advance by capturing enemy supplies, particularly fuel. The problem was that Germany's high command estimated they possessed only enough gasoline to cover roughly a third of the distance to their objective. Everything beyond that depended on seizing American fuel stocks. This dependence wasn't born from choice, but from catastrophic necessity. By late 1944, the Third Reich was experiencing an energy crisis of apocalyptic proportions. Allied bombing campaigns had systematically dismantled Germany's synthetic fuel infrastructure, reducing production by approximately 90%. The vital Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, once a crucial source of petroleum, had fallen into Soviet hands. The consequences rippled through every aspect of German society and military capability. The Luftwaffe's advanced jet aircraft sat idle on their runways, grounded by lack of kerosene. Civilian vehicles had virtually disappeared from German streets. The Gestapo hunted black market fuel dealers with the same intensity they reserved for political enemies. The arithmetic of German desperation becomes clear when examining production figures. Throughout 1944, the entire German war economy managed to produce approximately 33 million barrels of oil. During that same period, the United States alone produced 1.8 billion barrels. A single oil field in East Texas generated more petroleum than all of German-controlled Europe combined. While American refineries experimented with ways to utilize excess crude oil, German quartermasters made agonizing decisions about which armoured units could move and which had to remain stationary for lack of fuel. Peiper's Kampfgruppe embodied the contradictions of Germany's strategic position. His force included some of the most formidable armoured vehicles ever built. The Tiger II, with its nearly impenetrable frontal armour and devastating 88mm gun, could destroy any Allied tank at range. The Panther represented perhaps the war's finest balance of firepower, protection, and mobility. Yet these magnificent machines suffered from an insatiable appetite for gasoline. Each Tiger II consumed roughly 2.5 gallons of fuel for every mile travelled under ideal conditions. In the rugged Ardennes terrain, that figure could easily double. To put this in perspective, for every gallon of gasoline an American Sherman tank burned, a Tiger II required 3. For a nation with virtually no petroleum reserves, fielding an army of such fuel-hungry vehicles represented a fundamental strategic paradox. The German belief that superior quality could overcome quantitative disadvantage had created weapons that their economy couldn't support. An immobilized tank, regardless of how powerful its gun or how thick its armor, serves no purpose beyond that of an expensive stationary fortification. The logistical challenges extended beyond mere fuel consumption. German panzer divisions operated a bewildering variety of vehicle types, each requiring different fuels, different spare parts, different maintenance protocols. What had once been a strength now became a crippling weakness. Moving fuel to the front required countless trucks, each one a priority target for Allied fighter bombers that dominated the skies. By December 1944, the German supply system had devolved into desperate improvisation. Fuel was siphoned from damaged vehicles. Captured Allied jeeps were immediately drained of their gasoline. A commander like Peiper might nominally control nearly 100 tanks, but if he possessed fuel for only 30, his combat power was reduced accordingly. The offensive sent these fuel-starved predators forward with the expectation that they would sustain themselves by capturing enemy supplies. Hunters sent into the wilderness expected to live off their prey. Meanwhile, the American military operated within an entirely different material universe. To American soldiers, fuel was as ubiquitous and unremarkable as air itself. The logistical apparatus that made this possible ranked among the war's most impressive achievements. The Red Ball Express exemplified American logistical audacity. When Allied armies advanced so rapidly they outpaced their supply lines, American planners created a dedicated one-way truck convoy system. Roads were closed to all other traffic. At peak operation, nearly 6,000 trucks, predominantly GMC Jimmies driven mostly by African American soldiers, operated 24 hours a day in continuous loop. Over 82 days, they transported more than 412,000 tons of supplies. The operation itself consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel daily just to keep its own trucks running. This quantity of fuel, used merely to sustain the supply system itself, would have been unimaginable wealth to a German army group commander. Even more remarkable was Operation Pluto, an engineering feat that seems almost fantastical in hindsight. Flexible 3-inch diameter pipelines were laid across the English Channel seabed, creating a continuous, unstoppable flow of petroleum directly from England to the continent. From coastal depots, smaller pipeline networks branched out, following the advancing armies like an artificial circulatory system, pumping hundreds of thousands of gallons daily to forward areas. The scale defies easy comprehension. In late 1944, Allied forces in northwest Europe consumed 7.5 million gallons of fuel every single day. The US First Army alone, the formation that would bear the brunt of the German attack, maintained a reserve of 3.5 million gallons. One of the larger pipeline systems could deliver 300,000 gallons in a 24-hour period. This wasn't simply numerical superiority. It fundamentally altered American operational planning. American commanders designed campaigns with the comfortable assumption that fuel would always be available. While German generals agonized over every kilometer their forces advanced, American generals planned operations spanning entire countries. When the German offensive erupted on December 16th, it achieved complete surprise. Kampfgruppe Peiper poured through gaps in the American defenses, advancing as rapidly as their fuel supplies permitted. Near the village of Hürtgen, they overran a rest area belonging to an American armored division and made an extraordinary discovery. They found a US fuel and supply depot. To German soldiers who had spent years scrounging for every drop of inferior ersatz fuel, the sight was almost hallucinatory. A German officer later described walls of American jerry cans stacked 10 feet high, creating long corridors through the forest. The air, previously filled with the scent of pine and snow, now carried the sharp, intoxicating aroma of high-grade 80-plus octane gasoline, far superior to the 74-octane fuel their own engines struggled to burn. Initial estimates suggested 50,000 gallons, more fuel than many German divisions had seen in months, enough to refuel Peiper's entire battle group and power their dash to the Meuse River. The German soldiers were euphoric. They interpreted the discovery as validation of their operational plan, proof that the careless Americans would indeed supply the German advance through their negligence. However, the more observant among them began to notice troubling details. Among the supplies, they found recent American newspapers. The jerry cans bore shipping manifests that told an impossible story. This gasoline, refined in distant Texas, had crossed the Atlantic Ocean, been unloaded in France, and transported to this forward depot in less than 6 weeks. This wasn't some forgotten stockpile. It was a single drop from a continuously flowing river. The psychological impact intensified when German intelligence officers learned about the Allied pipeline infrastructure. They discovered that a single pipe, merely one of several feeding the front, could deliver 300,000 gallons of fuel daily. A German panzer division might consume that quantity during a month of intensive combat. Here was an invisible tube buried in the ground that delivered more fuel in one day than an entire armoured division could hope to receive in 30. Suddenly their 50,000-gallon prize seemed pathetic, pocket change, the equivalent of a wealthy man dropping a $20 bill and not bothering to retrieve it. For years, German propaganda had characterized America as a soft, racially mongrel nation, incapable of prosecuting total war. That comforting lie now shattered in the Belgian snow. As one German soldier later wrote, "How could anyone possibly defeat an enemy who regarded a treasure sufficient to save an entire German army as little more than a rounding error?" The discovery of that fuel dump marked the moment when many German soldiers understood with absolute certainty that the war was already lost. Yet the true demonstration of American material superiority wasn't revealed by the fuel the Germans captured, but by the fuel the Americans deliberately destroyed. American commanders made a straightforward, ruthless calculation. If the Germans required fuel to sustain their offensive, that fuel had to be denied to them through destruction. What followed was an act of material annihilation so profound, so alien to the German mindset, that it represented one of the ultimate demonstrations of industrial supremacy in military history. Near Stavelot, directly in Peiper's path, lay another depot containing not 50,000 gallons, but 2.5 million gallons of gasoline. As Peiper's tanks approached, a small group of American engineers received their orders and executed them without hesitation. They destroyed everything. From the German perspective, the scene was surreal and nightmarish. Your tanks are sputtering on fumes. Your nation's final hope is grinding to a halt. Then, beyond the next hill, you see a pillar of black smoke rising into the winter sky. You watch as American soldiers methodically open the spigots on thousands of fuel drums, allowing precious gasoline to pour into ditches before igniting it. At Stavelot, at Malmedy, at Spa, the pattern repeated. American engineers opened valves and threw grenades. An estimated 8 million gallons went up in smoke during just the first week of the battle. That single week of intentional destruction consumed more gasoline than the German High Command had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. To German soldiers, witnessing this was incomprehensible waste, like watching a starving man deliberately burn down a granary. To American commanders, it was sound doctrine. The loss was trivial. The supply chain was already compensating for the destruction. On December 17th, the US First Army destroyed 2.2 million gallons. The very next day, 1.8 million gallons were delivered to replace what had been lost. By Christmas Eve, total American fuel reserves in the theatre had actually increased since the battle began. This systematic denial sealed Kampfgruppe Peiper's fate. Blocked by stubborn American resistance at key points, with their promised fuel supplies transformed into smoke, their advance ground to a halt near La Glaise. Peiper's mighty Tiger IIs, the most powerful tanks in the world, became immobile steel coffins. On Christmas Eve, he received permission to abandon his vehicles and attempt to break out on foot. Of the 5,000 elite soldiers who had started the offensive, only 800 made it back to German lines. They hadn't been defeated by superior tanks or brilliant tactics. They had been defeated by empty fuel gauges and an enemy who could afford to fight with fire. When the guns finally fell silent in January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was celebrated as a great American victory, and indeed it was. But the battle had truly been won long before the first shot was fired. It was won in Texas oil fields, Detroit factories, and California shipyards. The Ardennes offensive represented the death throes of the German war machine, throwing its last elite formations and best remaining armour into a battle it couldn't sustain. The most fundamental cause of failure was logistics. The entire operational concept was fantasy, built on the assumption of capturing supplies from an enemy that possessed too much to lose any significant quantity. The contrast in industrial capability was almost obscene. In 1944, the United States produced more than 50 times as much crude oil as Germany. While German industry was being systematically bombed into rubble, Ford's Willow Run factory was producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. American shipyards were launching cargo vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. The Battle of the Bulge was the moment this statistical reality transformed into undeniable psychological truth. It marked the brutal end of the romantic notion that superior willpower could triumph over material disadvantage. The image of the dashing Panzer ace was rendered obsolete by the anonymous truck driver on the Red Ball Express. Churchill observed that petrol governed every movement in modern war. Stalin was characteristically more blunt, stating that the war was decided by engines and octane. The German soldiers who discovered that fuel dump believed they had found the key to victory. What they had actually discovered was a measuring instrument, a yardstick that revealed the vast, unbridgeable chasm between their exhausted nation and the industrial colossus they had so catastrophically underestimated. They were fighting with swords against an enemy wielding an entire production line. The story of the Battle of the Bulge and the American fuel dumps serves as a microcosm of the entire Second World War. The discovery of that single stockpile, representing more wealth than an entire German division could imagine, became emblematic of a conflict that had transcended traditional battlefield considerations. It was fundamentally a clash between two systems. One was running on the last fumes of fanatical ideology. The other was powered by an almost limitless river of industrial production. The German soldiers' shock wasn't merely about the quantity of fuel. It was the soul-crushing realization that they were fighting an enemy who could afford to be wasteful on a scale they couldn't begin to comprehend. It demonstrated conclusively that in modern warfare, the greatest weapon isn't always the most powerful tank, but rather the capacity to supply that tank endlessly. The industrial sinews of war proved more decisive than tactical brilliance or individual courage, a lesson written in burning gasoline across the snow-covered forests of Belgium.